there can be permanent damage, and if you don't catch it quickly enough. If a young person, say, has an acute case where they overdo it on the weekend and they become a little bit, have some scary psychotic thoughts, they go to the emergency room, they get some antipsychotic meds, and 3 days later they're fine. Now, here's the problem. Once a person has had a psychotic break, there's a study that shows that if they continue for 4 years, 50% of them become permanent paranoid schizophrenics, and they never recover, and they have to stay on medication their entire life. And there was another study that rather than talking about the duration of use, it was how many psychotic breakdowns they had. And it showed that after 3 psychotic breakdowns, most people never recovered.
All right, guys, welcome to the Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching YouTube channel. I'm here today with a guest, Dr. Doug Kindred, who is a PhD in optical physics. And I want to emphasize that because when you have a PhD, it means that you're able to do a level of research on things and understanding of research that I would say your average person doesn't do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to be talking to Dr. Doug Kindred today about cannabis-induced psychosis. And Doug, I want to start by asking, we've spoken before in the past, but why is this topic so important to you, and why do you feel it needs attention? Why did you get into this?
Sure. Thank you for having me on the show, Frank. About 6 years ago now, one of my family members developed psychosis, became psychotic, and it took quite some time to figure out what it was and why. Then another family member developed psychosis, and I was very concerned. I started reading psychiatry books. And in the process of reading those psychiatry books, they were all pointing me towards marijuana. And one in particular mentioned that at that time, 13% of all marijuana users become psychotic. And I thought, wow, that's a huge, huge number. And that drove me to look into the academic literature. And so I then started looking in psychiatric journals. I started reading everything on the CDC and NIH websites about cannabis-induced psychosis, looking particularly into the American Psychiatric Association's position on it and so on, and became very well-educated, I guess, in that field. Even though I'm certainly no medical doctor, I'm what I call a lay expert in it. And I probably have about 15,000 hours of observing patients in a cannabis-induced psychotic state. So I have a great deal of practical experience as well as, reading the academic literature. And then because of that, I'm aware of the problem. I start seeing it more and more and more. And over time now, I've met approximately 20 people just in our local community with family members suffering from it. The very first one was, I was pumping gas at the gas station. I walk in and the guy at the counter is telling the cashier that, well, my son tried to stab me over the weekend. And as we're walking out the door, I said, excuse me, sir, does your son happen to be on marijuana? He's like, oh yeah. He just smoked heavily with a bunch of his friends on a ski trip. And that pattern just seems to keep happening and happening. Another young man that I met at our church called me one night and says, Doug, there's witches on the ceiling and they're trying to kill me. And I'm like, Chip, have you been smoking marijuana? And he says, well, just one joint to help me sleep. So I had to talk him down out of that. He calls me back later. He says, Doug, they're outside the window. They're going to kill me. He says, but don't worry, I have a samurai sword. And I'm like, oh, keep that sword in the sheath. Met a young lady who threatened to kill herself and her daughter in a cannabis-induced bipolar manic state. And it just goes on and on. I mean, unbelievable, all these people that I've met that are suffering from this. And so that then led me to look into the magnitude of the problem. And as I mentioned in the video that you listened to, once again, all the studies showed that 10 to 15% of all users become psychotic. And these are a vast array of studies, there's domestic studies, foreign studies, small laboratory ones with 50 people, huge field studies with up to 18,000 people that they follow for 20 years. And all of them agree. Some of them are as low as, the lowest one I've seen says 9%, the highest was 16. So I kind of threw out the high and the low, and 10 to 15 roughly. And when you think about that magnitude of that problem, we've got approximately 50 to 55 million marijuana users in the United States. So that means, let's call it on the low end, we got 5 million extra additional psychotic people. And we talk about the mental health crisis in our country, well, that accounts for a big, big part of it. And so, I just continued to delve further into this. And one of the really common things, the side effects include suicide and homicide. And because of the nature of the psychotic thoughts. And I remember you and I had a really nice discussion one day, and you were talking about the psychotic thoughts being delusions of grandeur, right? I believe you mentioned that in the past.
I definitely did. Yes, I thought I was about to take over some business empire in my place, and when I looked at my bank account and what I was doing, I was like, well, this isn't making sense. When I looked back on it, there was no business empire being created. I was living at home with a single parent with $40 in my bank account, and I thought I was the Pablo Escobar of my profession for some reason. It was very strange.
And that's absolutely normal. I remember one of the cases I read was a 19-year-old young man who walked into a hospital and went to the cafeteria and got some lunch, and then he refused to pay for it. And he told the cashier that, he says, look, I own the hospital. I have $9 billion and you work for me. And so that's kind of a normal psychotic delusion. But my experience shows that happens, those type of delusions happen usually in the early phases of the psychosis at the lower doses, right? But as the patient continues using, and the THC builds over time. And that brings me to an important point. We all know that THC stays in your body at least 30 days, right? If you have to have a blood test, everybody says, yeah, we got to wait 30 days before it's out of your system. Well, let's imagine now a patient is using more than their body can metabolize every day. Every single day, they're adding to it, because they're using more than they can metabolize, and it just builds and builds and builds in their system. And eventually, their brain just breaks down. And so that's what happens. And they'll start out with these delusions of grandeur, but then they become more bizarre and more paranoid. And that's very common, that they become, extremely paranoid. They'll think the FBI is after them or the mob is after them, and so on. But eventually it gets even more bizarre, and they tend to start seeing witches, demons, ghosts, or the devil himself, and seeing and hearing, both auditory and visual hallucinations. And of course, those things are terrifying to the patient. And what I found is a lot of the younger people end up committing suicide. They can't handle those hallucinations. And the older people, some of the young ones too, end up killing because they start believing that the person, someone in their life, maybe a friend, a family member, could be their parents, spouse, is actually a demon, and they kill the demon. And so I've now read over 400 murder cases, and they're very gruesome, very bizarre, but they're all very similar. They're shockingly similar. And they almost always use the same weapon, typically knives, and multiple stabbings. They don't stab somebody twice. They stab them 40 times, 60 times, 100 times. And
Doug, did you see that
this
story
all gave me great concern.
Did you see that story not too long ago out of California? There was a woman who, maybe it was like a year ago, who stabbed her boyfriend 108 times to death. And then it was kind of a big story because she got off with just probation and no jail time. They kind of wound up blaming the boyfriend for giving her cannabis or something like that. That was pretty recently in the news cycles. And I'm pointing these stories out because some people are going to watch this and they're not going to believe it, or they're going to think this is opinion, and it's not opinion. Like, these are documented cases. And
Yes.
I want to throw out a statistic that you threw out before, because I do want to talk about the violence, but like, statistics, over 540,000 cases in the US that you cited in another video that you did on this, of cannabis induced psychosis, with 12,000 cases amongst California seniors alone. Not saying all those were violent, but just the magnitude of what does 9 to 16% of cannabis users look like. That's a huge number.
Yes. Frank, I'm really glad you brought me back to that. Let's go back to that statistic, because, I pointed out that, so out of the 50 million users, we probably have an additional 5 million people becoming psychotic. And when I say that to people, they're like, that can't be happening. We would all know. Well, okay, we just threw out a good statistic there of 540,000 people, and that was from the CDC's morbidity and mortality report. So once again, this is a viable source, and it's 540,000, and that was just young people under 25. And there's plenty of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s that are smoking weed and also becoming psychotic. Now, that number, I also believe, is seriously, seriously underreported, because I just mentioned to you that I've met approximately 20 people or 20 families in my town, right, that are going through this with usually a teenager, but sometimes an older person. And not one of them have been to an emergency room, right? So I just reported that 540,000 were emergency room cases. All these people I met, and my 2 family members that suffered from this, never went to an emergency room for this. So they would not be counted in that statistic. And, I've had people say, well, where are all these people? I'll tell you where they are. They're either in jail because they've assaulted someone, or they're in one of the local mental hospitals, involuntarily being treated, or they're at home terrorizing their own family because they're in terror themselves. Because of their psychosis. And go ahead.
Continue. No. Continue. I'll say it in a minute. Continue.
Okay. But so now I want to go to the case that you mentioned in California. The young lady's name was Bryn Spedker, a very nice young gal. And what you just said about 108 times. The headline in the Daily Mail was very interesting. It said, mentally well girl stabbed her boyfriend 108 times due to cannabis-induced psychosis. And so she had never had any mental illness before. And that's one of the things that people, particularly in the marijuana industry, say, well, yes, it makes people psychotic, but only those who are already prone to mental illness. This girl had no prior history of mental illness, no family history of mental illness. And what was a little unusual is I just mentioned to you that typically it takes time for the THC to build before people become psychotic. But I have now read 3 cases where it was almost instantaneous, where the person was not a marijuana user and they used it and became psychotic. Her case was shocking, but sadly, it's not uncommon in terms of what happened. So her boyfriend, a nice young man named Chad O'Melia, was a daily marijuana user, let's say. And he seemed to be able to handle it just fine. He was in that sort of, 85 to 90% of the people that it does not affect. But she was in that 10 to 15% that it does affect. So one evening, he convinced her to try it. She had been saying, no, I don't want to try weed. He convinced her to do so. She took one hit off the bong and then said, well, I really don't feel anything. So he said, well, let's add some more. So he put more marijuana in, toked up the bong really heavy so that the bowl was opaque, full of smoke, and told her to take a big hit. She did. And 5 minutes later, this is according to her own testimony in court, and it agrees with the security cameras in the apartment that saw her doing what I'm about to explain. She then ran into the bathroom screaming, and according to her testimony, it's because she heard demons telling her that she was in hell, she was actually dead, and that the only way for her to escape from hell was to kill someone. So she stayed in the bathroom screaming for a little while. Chad's, what's wrong, what's wrong? She comes running out of the bathroom into the kitchen, grabs a knife, and stabbed him 108 times. She then stabbed her dog to death. The girl was an audiologist, and she had just received her audiology degree and took this job in California. She had a hearing impairment herself, and that's why she wanted to help other people with who were hearing impaired. And she had a service dog, and she stabbed the dog. And by the time the police came, she was stabbing herself in the throat. I've read several cases almost identical to that. Literally, one of them literally having the same delusion that they were dead and in hell and they had to kill someone to get out. Unfortunately, this is not unusual. And as I mentioned, it's rather strange that, here in America, most murders are carried out with firearms. Among psychotic people, it's almost always stabbings with mostly knives, but it can be machetes or swords. And sometimes even with dismemberment, sadly. Then the second most common is vehicular homicide. It's not uncommon at all that they use cars when they're in this paranoid psychotic state. And I want to emphasize that the patient themselves is in a state of terror. They're really afraid, whether it's gone to that point where they're hearing demons and the devil, or at the point where they believe the mob is chasing them or the FBI is after them or whatever. And in any of those cases, the patient is in grave danger. And then, of course, the people around them are in danger because of the terror that patient is experiencing. And that's why I say this is an incredibly dangerous condition, and it's incredibly large. These studies are not really disputable. We've got all of them saying 10 to 15% of users. And can you imagine the FDA ever legalizing a medication where 10 to 15% of the people will become dangerously psychotic? It's unthinkable. And yet we're doing it.
And I want to ask you, so I've worked with people from all around the world when it comes to cannabis, and I have two stories, and it's ironic that you said stabbings and vehicular manslaughter, and I might have mentioned these to you before when we spoke in the past. I had one young girl. One night I was working with her for cannabis, didn't show any really signs of psychosis or anything, and she was from a different country, okay, outside of the US. We're just working with her. I'm working with her family, and I get this really weird text, phone call, voicemail one night, and I'm like, basically it was her telling me she was going to stab her parents, and it had same thing. It had to do with demons, and they're part of this demonic group, and I'm going to kill them. And basically I just wanted to let you know, goodbye. And it wasn't that coherent at all, but that was the gist of it. Okay. So I was able to get in touch with her parents. They obviously had no idea what was going on. I was like, you have to listen to me. She is on her way to your home. She did not live with them to stab you guys. Mm-hmm. And she was unfortunately apprehended by authorities without a violent ending on her part, because God forbid she had been shot or something would have happened, because she was armed and she was psychotic. There was one story. I had another mother call me once about her daughter, and she eventually was institutionalized. Again, did not show any signs of psychosis or psychotic behavior. And the mother told me one day they were driving in the car. The daughter took the car up above 100 miles per hour and kind of said, that's it. I'm doing this. My mom's a demon, and we're going off the side of the bridge. Somehow the mom was able to de-escalate the vehicle and the whole situation before they were thrown off the road. And then, like I said, shortly after that, she was involuntarily institutionalized for it. But those are two cases that I had personally worked with. And then I've had countless people call me in recovery from cannabis abuse and tell me about their stories of psychosis. And it is what you say. It's usually this demonic stuff. It's usually violence is a really big thing. And it's interesting because you pointed out to me it's early on where it's the visions of grandeur and things like that, and then it escalates. And even though I had a cannabis addiction, I would have never qualified as a super heavy user just because my day-to-day work life didn't allow it. It was only in the evenings I could use. And it's interesting that you pointed that out because you make me think, oh, I was probably on the verge of something really not good. But anyways,
You could have been.
to confirm what you're saying, like I've talked to people, and those two real stabbing and vehicular manslaughter were the two main modalities of threat.
Yes, absolutely. You know, so you go back to that, what you were just saying about being in that early stage, right? And I've seen that and watched the progression, and it's very, very frightening to watch and to see the progression of going from that delusion of grandeur to then the paranoia to then the really strong hallucinations, right? Where they're in absolute terror. And that brings me to the point of how we treat it, right? You just mentioned someone being involuntarily put into treatment.
Correct.
And this is and not only not only that, but also the diagnosis, right? Because here in Florida, we have what we call a Baker Act program, Baker Act, where the person, if they're a danger to themselves or others, for any mental health reason, can be sent to a local county psychiatric hospital. But they're supposed to diagnose and treat them within 3 days and then let them go. They can get a court order to extend that if the psychiatrist feels it's necessary. But what I've personally found is that the local psychiatrists here continued to diagnose the patients with either bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or with paranoid schizophrenia, maybe schizoaffective disorder, and not even dealing with the drug issue at all, not dealing with the marijuana. And you pointed out you had been an addict, and that's something also that people don't think of. There's a myth out there that marijuana is not addictive. I've heard many people say that, and yet the CDC says 30% of all users are addicted. 30%. That's a pretty darn high addiction.
A high number.
So, so we've got all these. Here's the problem: the patient either gets arrested or sent to one of these mental facilities and then misdiagnosed, giving antipsychotic medications that don't really work, and then they're released. And they're still in just as much danger, and the public's still in just as much danger. It's really a frightening situation. And so that's why I'm looking at the big picture here. When you legalize marijuana and you get more and more people in that condition, then how are you going to deal with it? And if you ask any cop in our area, oh, how many mental health cases do you have? They say it's doubled. In the last 5 years, it's doubled. They all say that. You go into any of these mental hospitals and you say, how many of your patients are using marijuana? And they laugh and they say 100%, all of them. That's a huge problem too. So
Doug, I think the literature out there, I think in your other video, which I'll link in the pinned comment to this video where you talk about these statistics, I think the literature, like published, reviewed literature, speaks to that, right? In cities and states and areas where they have legalized cannabis use, I think the suicidal ideation is higher, the violent crime is higher. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. Absolutely. Particularly Colorado, Washington, and California, because those are the states that had legalized it much longer ago. And it's just starting in the other states. I mentioned in that previous video that Boston University Medical Center just set up a program for treating cannabis-induced psychosis because they were getting so many patients in their emergency rooms and they didn't know how to handle it. But what I found here is, as I said, the psychiatrists are misdiagnosing, and you're aware of Aubrey Adams' website, Every Brain Matters, right? everybrainmatters.org. And Aubrey told me she's dealt with approximately 1,000 families with this problem. I've met 20. She's dealt with 1,000 of them, helping them. And I've listened to many of those. She has a lot of testimonials from these mostly young men that had been psychotic on marijuana, typically in their late teens. And almost all of them, the parents will say they were misdiagnosed. You know, nobody did anything about the marijuana. It was all, you know, oh, he's bipolar or he's schizophrenic, here, take this medication. And it never works. And I pointed out in that last video why it doesn't work, right? That THC is chemically very similar to anandamide. Anandamide is the naturally occurring cannabinoid in our brains, and people with paranoid schizophrenia have excess levels of anandamide, and that's what causes them to become psychotic. THC is almost identical chemically, but it's close, not exact. It actually is much stronger, and it lasts longer. Anandamide is called the joy molecule, and in normal people, say like if you or I have a joyful experience, our anandamide levels become elevated. But you know, well, how long does that last? 15 minutes, right? You graduate from college, you're all excited, and 15 minutes later, you're down off your high. Right?
It's just kind of normal now. All right, I'm graduating. New car. This is cool.
Right.
All right, it's normal now.
But
yeah.
Yes, new car. Right, you get a brand new car, and 3 days later, you're bored.
Yep. This is reality.
But I point that out for a reason, because we're using medications that are treating something like that that's more short-lived, right? Whereas the THC is not short-lived. The THC lasts a very, very long time. I just talked about how long it stays in your body, but this is a real point that I want to address too, is how long the person stays psychotic even after cessation of use. So if somebody is a heavy user of high doses of THC and they become psychotic, and then they actually go off the marijuana, they actually get worse during the withdrawal phase. And I've seen patients, 2 to 4 months, particularly the first 2 months, the psychosis just rages and gets way worse and more dangerous. And this is a problem in the criminal justice system, because you'll have a patient that kills someone when they're in a cannabis-induced psychotic state, and maybe they hadn't smoked for a week, right? The blood work gets done, and they say, oh, the patient hadn't smoked marijuana in a week, he couldn't have been high, right? And people don't even understand the difference between high and psychotic. It's a completely different thing. You know it because you've experienced it. Yeah. And so the toxicology report will say no drugs in their system, and and the forensic psychiatrist says couldn't have been high, and so the crime is not properly attributed to the drug. And I see this all over Florida, right? And I'm going to throw out one more example, and I promise I'll stop with the gruesome examples.
No, and then I want to ask you. There was a young man in the Tampa area. Throw out yours. Yeah.
Young man in the Tampa area. It's been over a year ago. Was smoking marijuana on his 21st birthday all morning long and all afternoon, and then unfortunately stabbed his girlfriend to death and threw their infant into the pond, and it was eaten by an alligator. I must have read 10 articles about that murder, and only one of them mentioned the marijuana. All the others said mental illness. Well, okay, maybe it's mental illness and marijuana, but one of the things I want to point out here is that in cases of, if you've got a person with bipolar or with paranoid schizophrenia and they use marijuana, it exacerbates their psychotic symptoms tremendously. I mean, I'm not talking 10%, I'm talking 10 times. It's just tremendous increase in the intensity of the psychosis. So, people with those conditions should never use. But, I'm seeing a lot of patients that have no prior history of mental illness, and it still does it. And I pointed out in that prior video, roughly half of the people with cannabis-induced psychosis are in the high-risk groups. half of them are just normal people. So, back to you said you had one, but I want to mention I was talking about the diagnoses and treatment. But go ahead. I'll finish that later.
Continue. I'll bring it up to diagnoses and treatment because there's two things. I want to ask you this. So I work in high schools and I work with a lot of young men and women, right? When it comes to substance use issues, and cannabis is the number one thing right now that I come across. Okay, sure. We might hit some pills and cocaine or alcohol, but it's really cannabis. And some of these kids, not saying kids that I directly work with, but they do become violent. Like they'll have to bring the resource office. I'll just simply say you have to go to your next class. The resource officer has to come into the room and escort them out of the room because they become so violent and agitated at the fact that our session is up or whatever. And the only thing they're on is cannabis. There's nothing else going on there. Maybe some nicotine. But here's my thing. I remember reading a toxicology report. I don't remember which or where, of a school shooter. And it said the way it worded it was so odd. It was like the only drug found was cannabis, and they just kind of brushed right over it. And this person had shot his peers, like a crazy act of violence, and they just brushed it off. Now, I thought immediately when I read that, I was like, if it was cocaine or amphetamines or heroin or something, they would have said, toxicology reports showed cocaine and heroin and this, and they would have talked about it. But in this case, it was, no, the only drug found was cannabis. This person was just a raging lunatic, and that's all there is to this case. Have you seen any literature about school violence in cannabis?
Yes, I have. It's a big problem, actually. And look, what you just said, let me address that first, where the dismissive tone, right? I've seen many murder cases where they say no drugs in their system, just THC. They're literally dismissive of, right? That it couldn't have been that, right? And there is, for some reason, and I think it's just years of propaganda, that people don't want to believe that cannabis can cause psychosis. And yet it seems absolutely ludicrous to me that we think a psychoactive substance won't make people psychotic.
I don't understand it.
The FDA,
it binds the receptors on the brainstem. It does all this. I don't get it either. Doesn't make sense.
In terms of literature on the school shooters, there was a paper, and I'm sorry I can't remember the exact date or title, but it was something like, I put a link to it in that previous video.
I'll find it and link it up.
There was a paper where they studied, they studied 14 cases of violence, mostly mass shooters, and that included Nicholas Cruz at Parkland High School. It included Dylan Roof, which I think was the church shooter in South Carolina. It included a whole bunch of these high-profile ones, and then most of the ones that have been since then, I've confirmed that they were also either psychotic or at least paranoid due to cannabis use. So yes, there's a really good paper on that. And one of the things they point out in that paper is they say it's preventable, right? We just got to stop people from using weed. Yet people love their weed so much, right?
That's the saddest thing. I see the writing on the wall with some students. I'm not saying I identify who's going to be violent or not violent, but I can see that things are taking a bad trend with some younger people. And I know that there they are hitting that cartridge all day long. And it's just a gut feeling. It's like, this is not, something's wrong. Something is wrong here. And it's being totally overlooked. And okay, Doug, I want to bring you back to something. And I think you were going to talk a little bit about this, the diagnosis. Why do we think you said you wanted to touch on diagnosing this? Maybe why is it not being diagnosed? Why is this being overlooked so much? I think that was the direction we were headed.
Yes. And, let's talk about the reason this is happening and then the diagnosis. The reason it's happening is because the THC levels are now so high. And when I was young, it was 2 to 3%. in the 1970s. The smokable weed now on the street, they say, is typically 15 to 20, and the medical stuff is sort of 20 to 35% THC. So we're looking at 10 times the level that it was in the 1960s and 70s. So, and because of that, you know, a lot of the older people remember the marijuana from my era, and they think it was safe. And so they think, well, it's just marijuana, it's just safe. And so that perception, I think, has carried on through the decades, that it's safe because of that, when in reality, when you increase the dose by a factor of 10, or sorry, the concentration by a factor of 10, it's really getting scary. The other thing is the route. You know, when you smoke it, it's one thing. And what I've noticed is usually when people smoke it, it takes the patient a long time to become psychotic, months, many months. And the progression is very gradual. And, you know, you just see it a little bit at a time. What's scary is when they ingest it. Any form of ingestible, whether it's the oils, concentrates, wax or shatter, brownies, cookies, any of those things make it much more dangerous, and I'm going to explain why. When you smoke it, the THC, the delta-9 THC in typical marijuana goes directly from the lungs into the bloodstream, just like when you smoke a cigarette, the nicotine goes directly into your bloodstream. However, when you ingest it, one of the things people warn you about is, well, you can overdo it because it takes time to get processed when you eat it. It doesn't go directly into your blood. So people will eat too much. That's not the main risk. It is a risk. The real problem is when you ingest it and your liver processes that delta-9 THC is no longer delta-9. Your liver transforms it into an 11-hydroxyl THC. And when you study chemistry, you find out that hydroxyl molecules are very small. Delta-9 molecules are much larger. We're looking at roughly a factor of 10 in the diameter of that molecule. So an 11-hydroxyl THC molecule can transfer across the blood-brain barrier 10 times more effectively. So for the same concentration and same dose of THC, if you eat it, you get 10 times more THC in your brain than if you smoke it. And it was well known even when I was a kid. Nobody knew why. We didn't understand the chemistry, but there were the kids that just smoked a couple joints on the weekend and got silly, right? Had fun. But the kids that were intense potheads, they would eat the brownies or cookies and they would go on a trip, right? They would start having delusions and hallucinations and paranoia. And if you ask any Jamaican, they'll tell you the same thing. What happens when they eat it? And they go, oh man, it's bad. So, you know, this is something that I think, really, frankly, I think all ingestibles should be illegal. And all these oils that are 90% and concentrates that are 90%, that is just way too dangerous.
And the crazy thing is they're using a
but
lot
back
of these,
to, okay.
the crazy thing is they're using a lot of these edibles and oils and things to treat mental health disorders in a lot of cases from a medical standpoint. That's one thing that just like I can't wrap my head around. And I interviewed Dr. Anna Lemke. She's like really high up at Stanford University, and we talked about this. And I was like, what do you think about that? She basically said it's a terrible idea. She was like, the literature totally disagrees with the use of these products for mental health disorders, one. And then two, on the note of edibles, I can confirm what you're saying. I know out of Canada, there's a lot of good literature that has connected a lot of these hospital visits with schizophrenia, suicidal attempts, suicidal ideation, and there is a much higher incidence among edibles and things like that as compared to just your traditional smoking it. So, yeah.
Right. You know, so regarding the diagnosis issue, you know, one of the reasons that people haven't seen a lot of it, particularly in the rural areas, right, is that this is a fairly new phenomenon in terms of having those high THC levels. They didn't exist 10 years ago. And now with these really high THC levels, we see a lot more cases. And symptomatically, the patient does present almost identical to a paranoid schizophrenic. So it's hard to know. I've had psychiatrists tell me it's hard to know how much of it is from the weed and how much of it's from, a mental illness. But the family members do know, right? Because the family members know this person. And that's what happened with all of those teenagers that Aubrey has been dealing with, that their parents say, hey, my son was never, he was never psychotic. And it only happens when they're on the marijuana. The hard part about it is determining, okay, if they're always sane when they're off and they're always insane when they're using, then it's pretty clear that this is a case of cannabis-induced psychosis. And there's a lot of cases like that, probably half of them. But the other half are dual diagnoses, where it's a bipolar person or a paranoid schizophrenic person that's using weed, and then that weed causes their psychotic symptoms to worsen. Now, why do they do that? They do it because they get a short-term relief, and they can't see that it's actually making them worse. What I found is that a person with bipolar who starts using marijuana to calm themselves, they do get a calming effect for 2 or 3 hours. And in the 4th hour, that starts to wear off. So then they smoke more. And then they get another short-term calming effect, and then it gets even worse. And each time it worsens more and more and more. But all they can see is that short-term calming effect, and they say, see, it's helping me. And this is true. A lot of them self-medicate. And there's a good paper in Psychiatric Times called Cannabis Induced Bipolar Disorder. And it explains why people with bipolar should never use marijuana. So a lot of it is that we didn't have the high THC in the past. We do now. And the other is most of the academic literature that I've read has been since 2019. So it's really recent academic literature. This is not stuff they learned in school, in medical school. Now, there was work before that, and I pointed out, one paper in 2017 about the mass shooters, one in 2015 about PTSD. And that one really floors me, because there's this great paper, which I also put in the links of that other talk, that showed that when patients with PTSD use marijuana to treat their PTSD, their symptoms got worse and they become much more violent. And yet, here in Florida, in the medical marijuana program, it's the most common reason that marijuana is prescribed. And so they're prescribing a product that has been proven to make the symptoms worse. And yet, once again, that patient will then go back to their marijuana doctor and say, gee, doc, it's helping me a lot. It's really working, because they only see the short-term benefit. And then, as I pointed out, one of those patients ended up stabbing his wife.
I don't know if you know about. I don't know if you know about the mechanism for PTSD, but I was watching a podcast once with a sleep expert on it, and he kind of proposed that, similar to alcohol, marijuana blocks REM sleep. And REM sleep is what you need to process thoughts, emotions, stressful events, and things like that.
Yes.
So he was saying, look, you're getting the sedative effect, and that's why you feel that it's helping you sleep better, because your body's not releasing that adrenaline during PTSD. But he was like, which is what happens when someone who has PTSD sleeps. But he said, long term, what's happening is you're blocking REM sleep. You're preventing your brain from processing all of this stuff. And if you starve your brain long enough, you're eventually going to find yourself in a psychotic state. And now your brain can't differentiate between a dream state and a waking state. And that was kind of some of he didn't directly say it, but I was like, oh, I think that's the mechanism that maybe you're referencing. I don't know for sure, and I don't even know if there's literature out there on that, but that was something that I heard. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I can't confirm or deny that. But it makes sense, Frank. And, right on the CDC website, it tells you one of the symptoms of using marijuana is insomnia. Yeah. And yet people use it to treat insomnia. Once again, it's that short-term effect, right?
Yeah.
It's the short-term effect, and it's depriving them of the REM sleep. So then the patient will keep using more and more to try to get more and more sleep. And then before you know it, they're sleeping 2 hours a night.
Yeah.
Because they
And
literally can't go to sleep.
Who wouldn't go psychotic after 2 hours of sleep a night for months on end, right?
For months
who
and
wouldn't
months.
Go psychotic.
Yes.
Who
Exactly.
wouldn't lose their mind?
Absolutely.
So
everybody.
Everyone. Doug, now here's my question. Why do you think we're in this position? Why don't you think, why isn't there a warning at the dispensary? I just heard recently they're putting warnings on things for the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, the vomiting syndrome that can happen.
Yep.
But alcohol has warnings, cigarettes has warnings. Why isn't this recognized?
Yes.
Why isn't this being talked about? Do you have any ideas as to that?
I'm sorry, I really don't. I'm just as baffled as you are about this. There's one prosecutor it requires them to warn the patients about psychosis. So that one county in Illinois, if you have a dispensary there, you have to put a sign up that explains it and put a label on the products. And then also in Vermont, those are the only two places I know of that have enacted this. I know California has had it on the ballot to put these warning labels on, but I don't think they've done it. I'm not sure. But this really needs to be shouted from the rooftops. I mean, it's such a big problem and such a serious problem that it has to be dealt with. People are in danger and people are dying. And, there's that old adage that, well, nobody ever died from marijuana use. Well, yeah, they have. And more than that, they've killed other people.
Yeah, and it's sad because people typically think of this as a calm drug, you're getting stoned, you have the munchies, and you're watching a movie. And like you addressed, for a fairly large percentage of people, when you think about it, a fairly large number of people, when you convert that percentage to numbers, that's actually not the case. That's happening. It's not just getting stoned and getting the munchies and watching a TV show. It's a major problem, and I'm thrilled to be talking to you about it because you are one of the few people that I know that has incredible, unfortunately, because you were forced to have an incredible amount of knowledge on this topic.
Yeah.
But hopefully what you've gone through in the research, we can get this message out there. And guys, I want to throw out there, I don't know, are you familiar? There's a book out there. It's called Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence by Alex Byrne and Son. Are you familiar with that book at all?
Berenson. Absolutely. It's fantastic, and Alex is right on.
Okay. I didn't know. He came out. This is why I think, I'll answer why I think. I'll give my opinion why I think they're not doing it. I think it's politics. I don't think a politician or a political person wants to put their name behind slowing down the legalization of marijuana. I know the amount of scrutiny I get and how brutally I get attacked online for talking about this stuff. And I think a large portion of it is they just want to save face. They don't want to be the person. And I remember when Alex went on national news, the author of this book, he got torn apart for his news segment. I mean, people were up in arms. How dare he talk about marijuana this way? Oh, he must have been part of the reefer madness movement. And I think I can't help but wonder if that's part of it. No one wants to stamp their name on this.
Of course it is, Frank. And I can verify that because, when I was discovering all of this, I wrote it up and immediately contacted my state senator and state representative and said, hey, we need to, work through the legislature to change the laws here to protect people. And they wanted nothing to do with it. And only one representative was very frank about it. He says, Doug, you're the only person I've ever talked to that thinks marijuana is bad. And there's all my other constituents love it. And therefore I would never do anything to, go against legalization of marijuana. And I'm like, it's killing people. And nobody else would, and most of the rest of them would not respond to me at all. They just won't get back to me. And I've had the same result from the director of the Office of Medical Marijuana Use and the state surgeon general.
Yeah.
I can't get their attention, right?
No. Well,
And
hopefully this interview gets some people's attentions. Hopefully we connect with someone or a
yes,
family. And hey, you listed, can you give the website again for the brain? What's the website we said earlier? I'm
yes,
blanking.
everybrainmatters.org.
Yep. That's it.
Everybrainmatters.org. And
Well,
it's an excellent website because she not only covers the issue of psychosis, but she covers addiction and hyperemesis syndrome and brain development and auto accidents, impaired driving, all these kind of dangers, and all of which are just tremendous. So
that's
yeah, it's a
fantastic.
big problem, and yeah.
Doug, is there anything else that you'd like to share? I have a feeling we'll be doing this again sometime in the future and having a part 2 and maybe a part 3 to this conversation. I think that will be necessary. But is there anything else for today that a message that you got for people? Just anything that you'd like to share with people as we wrap up here?
Well, I'll just kind of state the obvious. Look, when it happens to 10 to 15% of all users, everybody has to be super careful. I mean, frankly, I would prefer nobody use it because I just feel it's too risky. You're right. There is one more thing I forgot to add, and I'd like to bring this up, is the permanence of the damage. There can be permanent damage, and if you don't catch it quickly enough. If a young person, say, has an acute case where they overdo it on the weekend and they become a little bit, have some scary psychotic thoughts, they go to the emergency room, they get some antipsychotic meds, and 3 days later, they're fine. Now, here's the problem. Once a person has had a psychotic break, there's a study that shows that if they continue for 4 years, 50% of them become permanent paranoid schizophrenics, and they never recover, and they have to stay on medication their entire life. And there was another study that rather than talking about the duration of use, it was how many psychotic breakdowns they had. And it showed that after 3 psychotic breakdowns, most people never recovered. So they would become permanent paranoid schizophrenics. And I quoted a paper in that last video that stated, now at this point in time, 30% of all cases of paranoid schizophrenia are now attributed to marijuana. So another shocking statistic. So, if this goes too far with a young person or an older person, they can become mentally ill the rest of their entire life and totally destroy their life, their future, their career, their education, and all their relationships. It's that damaging. And so it's a serious condition, and I'm just kind of fed up that people are so pro marijuana and think how great it is. And maybe it is for 85% of people, but it sure as hell isn't for the rest.
Yeah.
So
And
that's what I want to leave you with.
Of course, and we can't neglect those others that's not working for. Doug, thank you for being here today, and I'm sure we'll have a follow-up conversation in the future. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for this.
Same here. Thank you, Frank.